in gender, power, or inequality is a betrayal of our Constitution, our values, and humanity. We will make sure that this report is implemented.
Yes, so the reactions of President William Ruto after the Lady Justice Nancy Baraza's committee, that is a task force that was tasked towards assessing the effectiveness and existing responses to GBV and femicide, as well as proposing legal, institutional and policy reforms, finally came up with this report and presented it to the president, so that then as a country we seek to see how best we can implement the recommendations. And speaking of the recommendations, I will come to the screen and walk you through some of the numbers that are playing out in the country and just how much of a risk we are at, according to the task force, and what needs to be done. If you look at the screen right here, GBV and femicide cases in Kenya, where we are at or where we stand in terms of numbers, over 1,600 women killed in about 3 years. 77% of perpetrators are known to be victims. 16% of femicide occurs within the family setup. This is what the report highlights. And of course, it also speaks of, yes, still on the numbers, where about women that are aged 30 to 44 are the most affected with these numbers of femicide as well as gender-based violence, and that there is no centralized femicide database in Kenya, which is a huge concern. And we will expound some more on the question of data as we continue. We also have that GBV costs Kenya about 40 billion annually. I think during that, session there, we also saw the chairperson of the task force highlighting that and saying that this is a huge dent to the economy. As well, experts warn that crisis is preventable, well, which is something that is supposed to be positive, and that's what we'll be expounding more later on as well. So GBV and femicide cases in Kenya still, who are the perpetrators? 66% aged 18 to 35, young men most at risk. We also speak of, the persons that have been killed by someone known, or that these persons that actually get to lose their lives are normally killed by people that they are close to and they know rather too well. Husbands account for around 40%. This is to say that also the report highlights that it is in that home setup or marital setup that these cases of gender-based violence are high. Where are the cases highest? Nairobi, Nakuru, Meru, Kiambu, they lead. And there's some areas or some counties where the report says there are 0 cases as to the same. It's quite interesting to note that are they 0, or maybe they have not been highlighted, or people actually do not go out there to report. The rising trend is that cases rising sharply since 2022. That then perhaps informs the reason why we say it is a national disaster, and that 48.5% increase, of course, we'd be expecting more in terms of numbers, which is unfortunate, or better yet, perhaps with the efforts that have been put on board to address the same, maybe the numbers would go down. Intimate partner violence behind many killings, as we have highlighted earlier on, and that GBV in Kenya is beyond physical abuse. What are some of these other GBV cases that we have? The rising trend, we have economic, emotional, and digital abuse. GBV often ignored. I mean, someone could be harassing you economically, emotionally, without your knowledge. That tech-facilitated GBV on the rise. You remember that when we're talking about the 16 days of activism, the largest, or perhaps the theme was largely centered on online gender-based violence, where most of the people on that digital space are violated, and sometimes they do not even know whether this amounts to violation. Sometimes they don't get to report and all that. Awareness is rising, but unfortunately, the silence persists, that when it happens to you, you choose silence. When it happens at that home setup, you perhaps say it should be normalized. There are instances where we've had women even saying that, if your man does not hit you, then he doesn't love you. That's unfortunate. And what, of course, the report highlights too is that this is happening to our men out here. And also, one of the rising trends is that youth-led activism is driving public accountability, which perhaps could be a plus, but just how much are we getting there in terms of addressing the same? The report speaks hugely on the question of data and the gap that exists therein, conflicting numbers across the different sources that present data, that, there is no unified national femicide database, which is quite unfortunate, and perhaps I think this also is part of the recommendations as to how we can deal with gender-based gender-based violence and femicide in Kenya, and that there's lack of inclusive data and, of course, leaving survivors invisible. That is on the gap that continues to exist. On the other end, we see the recommendations that have been presented by the task force, and of course under different categories where they speak of high-level strategic actions. Underneath, there are a couple of proposals that are there: legal policy as well as regulatory actions, administrative actions, prevention and awareness. Also, there's data as well as monitoring and gender mainstreaming in correctional services. What are some of the key recommendations that are here? Let's look at them. There are about 37, but we have picked a few of them where, of course, the task force recommends that GBV and femicide be declared a national crisis, which I think the president, upon receiving the report, indeed went ahead to say that there is need for this to be addressed, and at an extensive manner. And of course, the launch of presidential awareness campaign on GBV, the president, as well as you have seen, says that they will make sure that the report is implemented, that perhaps to agree that there needs to be a presidential guide. CCTV installation in what you would call short stay apartments, commonly, of course, some would say Airbnbs and the likes. This is one that is bound to spark reactions across, and I think is one thing that we would want to expound some more on that, and just looking at the possibilities of this. They say that we need to establish a dedicated GBV and femicide police unit. One would want to ask, have we not been having this in the country, and what does that mean? And just how much committed are we to ensure that that is achieved? They also go ahead to say it's important that we create National GBV Femicide Response Fund. They have gone ahead to say that, of course, Treasury should ring-fence at least 50 billion shillings in 2026-2027 financial year. But we've also seen lots of monies channeled towards addressing cases of gender-based violence in the country. Where is the accountability? What is the guarantee that if this is done, then we are going to get answers? How much will it address in the long run, short term, or immediately? Those are the questions that we would be asking. Also, they recommend an establishment of one-stop GBV recovery centers. What does this mean? We'll also get to expound that shortly as well. They go ahead to say that there's need to develop stand-alone sexual harassment policy. What again does that mean? We'll be getting to expound on it. And speaking of what would be very controversial, and what we will, get also here from, Airbnb owners and persons that perhaps would be beneficiaries of these short stay spaces. So this is pretty much an overview of what you would expect in terms of that recommendation and what it would mean, especially when it comes to the question of data and privacy. And that in Kenya, the Constitution guarantees the right to privacy, that is including at that level of our very own homes. But of course, recent reports show that most femicide cases get to happen, in rentals like Airbnbs, sparking calls for cameras inside units. And the report extensively speaks about that, and the recommendations actually say it is for this very reason that they would recommend that this gets to that level. And that, of course, currently CCTV is legal in entrances, and we have gotten to see that. Shared spaces, but installing cameras in bedrooms or bathrooms would certainly violate that privacy. What are the chances that we would set up strong policies that would back this recommendation? And at what level does it have to go so that then we do not cross that line on the question of privacy? Also, the experts suggest alternatives that would mean strict guest verification, as well as emergency alert systems, and also clear reporting protocols, that is to improve safety without constant surveillance. I think most of the people will tell you that before it even gets to that level, they have tried to make sure that they implement some of these recommendations. But is it to levels where we would say they would help reduce these cases? Because the numbers are shooting up by the day, and I think the most recent cases have largely been happening within these setups, therefore pushing for that need. Well, the debate continues as to whether then how do we get to protect the guests at this particular level, and also considering that it is within their rights that their privacy then is protected. And speaking of which, we get to loop in